right, welcome to another deep dive, everybody. We love getting your requests, and today's is super interesting. You sent us this really detailed piece, and it dives right into the heart of a big debate.
Yeah, it's definitely a response to some pretty heavy criticism.
It really is. So, to be specific, we're looking at response to burden of proof, a comprehensive review of the feasibility of 100% renewable electricity systems. And, for simplicity, let's just call it this study as we go along.
Sounds good. Makes it easier to follow.
Exactly. So this study is tackling head-on the idea of, well, is it even technically possible to power everything, all our electricity, with just renewables?
Right, right. The original paper that this is a response to, they basically threw down the gauntlet. They said, prove it.
Prove that 100% renewables can actually work. Okay, so that's the challenge the study is picking up. And they do it by first kind of laying out like the ground rules. They distinguish between feasibility and viability.
Right, and that's super important because those words get thrown around a lot, but they have very different meanings in this context.
So break it down for us. What's the difference according to this study?
So when they talk about technical feasibility, they're being very specific. They mean, can we do it physically using technology that either exists right now or is like right around the corner, ready to go, no sci-fi, just stuff we can build and use today.
Okay, so it's like, can the laws of physics and our current engineering capabilities make this happen?
Exactly. And then socioeconomic viability broadens the scope. That's about, okay, it might be technically possible, but can we actually do it in a way that makes sense for society, the environment, and our wallets?
So it's like, yeah, we could build a giant solar farm in the middle of the Sahara Desert, but is that realistically going to solve Europe's energy needs, considering the cost, the transmission lines, and everything else?
Exactly. And the authors of this study, they argue that a lot of the feasibility problems that critics point out are really viability issues.
Interesting. Okay, so with those definitions in mind, this study dives into the specifics, right? And one of the first things they tackle is the whole question of energy demand.
Right, because the critics, they were skeptical. They were looking at projections for the future and saying, hold on, some of these 100% renewable scenarios, they assume we're going to use way less energy overall.
Which, on the face of it, seems a little strange. We have a growing global population, lots of people who need more energy to reach a decent standard of living.
Exactly. So how do you make that math work? This study actually offers a few really interesting counterpoints. First, they talk about how the way we measure energy actually changes when we move to renewables.
Okay, so it's not just about using less, it's about how we account for it.
Right. When you burn fossil fuels, a lot of energy gets lost as heat, right? But with renewables like wind, solar, and hydro, that initial energy capture is measured more directly.
So even if we're using the same amount of electricity in the end, just switching to renewables makes our primary energy consumption, as they call it, go down.
Yeah, exactly. And this study cites definitions from organizations like the International Energy Agency to back that up.
Makes sense. So that's one way those numbers can work out. What else does this study say?
Well, second, they talk about energy efficiency. Like, there's a huge amount of room for improvement in how we use energy. Better insulation in buildings, more efficient appliances, smart grids that help us manage demand.
Oh, right. Like that classic example of switching from an old light bulb to an LED. You get the same amount of light, but use way less energy.
Exactly. And then the third point this study makes is about, well, the fossil fuel industry itself. It takes a ton of energy to extract oil and gas, to transport it, to refine it, even to mine and process uranium for nuclear power.
Right. All that energy just disappears from the equation when we switch to renewables.
Exactly. And to really illustrate this study uses the European Union in 2015 as a case study. They say, imagine if the EU had transitioned to mostly renewable electricity back then, used electric heat pumps for heating, and switched to electric vehicles.
Okay, so electrifying a lot of things that currently run on fossil fuels.
Right. Their analysis shows that the EU's primary energy consumption could have been almost 50% lower, like a 49% reduction, without any change to the actual energy services people were using.
Wow, that's huge. Almost cutting their energy use in half.
Yeah, and final energy consumption would have been a third lower too. So this study really emphasizes that there are multiple ways to achieve those lower demand projections, even as the world develops and more people need access to energy.
Okay, that's pretty compelling. But even if we manage demand, there's still the big issue of, well, wind and solar aren't always available, right? The sun doesn't always shine. The wind doesn't always blow.
Yeah, that's the classic intermittency problem. And the critics, they argue that To really account for that, you need super high resolution modeling, like simulating the entire energy system down to the minute or even faster.
Because the output of a solar panel can change drastically in just a few minutes if a cloud passes over, right?
Exactly. But this study pushes back on that a bit. They say, look, when you're dealing with large geographical areas, hourly resolution is generally good enough.
Wait, really? Hourly? That seems pretty coarse when we're talking about fluctuations that can happen in
I
seconds.
know, right? But they have an interesting argument. They talk about this idea of statistical smoothing. Like, think about wind farms. One farm might see a sudden drop in wind speed, but another one, hundreds of miles away, might see an increase. Those short-term variations tend to cancel each other out over a large enough area.
Ah, so the bigger the grid, the more those little ups and downs kind of average out.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
They even cite studies done on the island of Ireland, which has a pretty small grid. And even there, the cost differences between hourly and 5-minute simulations were surprisingly small.
So this study is saying that hourly modeling is good enough to figure out how much flexibility we need in the system overall.
Right. Finer resolution might be important for really specific things, like how individual power plants respond, or maybe for small, isolated grids. But for the big picture, they say hourly is sufficient.
Okay, that's interesting. But what about those extreme events? I'm talking about like weeks of low wind and sun or droughts that affect hydropower. Surely those require more than just hourly averages to plan for.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And this study acknowledges that these scenarios need to be considered, but they focus on the technical feasibility of having backup capacity.
Like power plants that can be quickly ramped up when needed, even if they aren't running all the time.
Exactly. They talk about modern open-cycle gas turbines as an example. They're efficient, they can be turned on quickly, and they can burn fuels like hydrogen produced from renewable energy sources.
Okay, so even in a 100% renewable scenario, there might still be a role for gas turbines, at least as a backup.
Potentially, yeah. And what's really striking is their cost estimate. They use Germany as an example. Germany's peak electricity demand is around 80 gigawatts. And this study says that maintaining enough gas turbine capacity to meet that entire demand, even if all renewables were offline, would add less than 0.01 euro per kilowatt hour to the overall cost of electricity.
Wait, so less than a tenth of a cent per kilowatt hour. That seems surprisingly cheap for that kind of insurance policy.
Right. And they emphasize that this is a worst-case scenario. Like, they assume no contribution from hydropower, biomass, no help from neighboring countries, no fancy demand management strategies.
So in reality, the cost would probably be even lower.
Most likely, yeah. They also point out that extreme weather events rarely affect every country in Europe at the same time. So you can have a system where countries support each other through interconnections.
Ah, that makes sense. Share the burden, so to speak.
Exactly. And on hydropower, they agree that dry years are a big concern if you're relying heavily on hydro. But they also remind us that hydro is really valuable for balancing wind and solar because you can control when it generates electricity.
Oh, right. You can't just tell the sun to shine or the wind to blow, but you can open the gates on a dam when you need power.
Exactly. And this study even mentions that nuclear power, which is often seen as reliable, can also be affected by extreme weather. Droughts and heat waves can impact cooling systems, leading to shutdowns.
So it's a reminder that no energy source is perfect. All right, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the grid itself. One of the big criticisms of 100% renewable scenarios is that they kind of gloss over the need for massive grid upgrades. What does this study have to say about that?
Yeah, the critics argue that you can't just assume we'll magically have all the transmission and distribution infrastructure we need. They want to see more detailed modeling of how those lines and substations will be built.
Okay, and this study acknowledges that point, right?
They do. But they emphasize that from a technical perspective, expanding the grid is definitely doable. We know how to build high-voltage transmission lines. We know how to upgrade substations. We have the technology for smart grid management.
So there's no fundamental engineering problem that prevents us from building a grid capable of handling a lot more renewable energy.
Exactly. And they point out that even though many 100% renewable studies don't go into super granular detail about the grid, they do include cost estimates for grid expansion.
Okay, so even if they don't show you a map of every new power line, they're still factoring the cost into their models.
Precisely. And what's interesting is that this study highlights that grid costs, while significant, aren't the biggest part of the overall expense.
Really? So how much of the total cost do they represent, according to this study?
They cite figures suggesting it's usually somewhere between 10% and 15% of the total system cost, at least in the European context.
Okay, that's still a lot of money, but it's less than I would have guessed.
Yeah, and they even break it down further. They look at various studies and reports from groups like Imperial College, NERA, DNVGL, and others, all focused on Europe and Germany specifically. And one interesting finding is that the cost of upgrading the distribution grid, that's the local network, that brings power to homes and businesses, is often higher than the cost of expanding the long-distance transmission network.
That makes sense. There are so many more local connections to deal with. It's not just a few big power lines.
Exactly. And this study also addresses this idea that we'll need a huge increase in cross-border transmission lines to balance out renewable energy fluctuations across different countries. They acknowledge that studies focused specifically on interconnections often show a need for significant expansion. But they point out that when you model the whole grid system in more detail, including the lines within individual countries, the overall need for new transmission capacity might not be as high.
Okay, so there's a bit of a balancing act, right? You might need more interconnections to take advantage of geographical diversity and renewable resources, but you can also reduce the need for those lines by building out the grid within countries and using more local storage solutions.
Exactly. And that brings in the whole question of public acceptance, too. People might be more willing to accept new transmission lines within their own country than lines that connect to other countries. So it's not just about the technical aspects, but also the social and political factors.
Right, right. Okay, so it sounds like grid upgrades are a big deal, but this study is saying they're manageable, both technically and economically. Now, let's dive into something that's absolutely essential for a stable grid: ancillary services. Can you explain what those are and why they're especially important when we're talking about a grid with lots of renewables?
Absolutely. Ancillary services are kind of like the behind-the-scenes work that keeps the electricity grid running smoothly. They're things like having enough reserve power ready to go if there's a sudden drop in generation or a spike in demand, keeping the grid's frequency stable, which is related to inertia, providing voltage support to ensure power quality, having enough fault current for safety systems to work properly, and being able to restart the entire system after a blackout, which is called black start.
Okay, so it's like the nuts and bolts that make sure the electricity system is reliable and safe.
Exactly. And traditionally, a lot of these services have been provided by large spinning generators in conventional power plants. Like the inertia of those big turbines spinning helps to keep the grid's frequency stable.
But renewables like wind and solar, they work differently.
They do. Wind turbines, for example, don't have that same big rotating mass to provide inertia. And solar panels, well, they only generate electricity when the sun is shining. So the concern is, how do we ensure all these essential services in a grid that's dominated by renewables?
And this study tackles this head on, right? They offer some solutions.
They do, and it's a mix of existing and emerging technologies. For things like fault current, voltage support, and inertia, they highlight the growing use of synchronous compensators, or SCs. These are basically large electric motors that just spin without actually driving any load. By spinning, they can provide inertia, contribute to fault current, and help stabilize voltage, all without burning any fuel.
So it's like adding dedicated devices to the grid to provide those specific functions.
Exactly. And this study provides examples of SEs being used in grids around the world, like in Germany, Denmark, Tasmania, the US, and the UK. They even cite a cost analysis that suggests deploying SCs in Great Britain would only add a tiny fraction of a cent per kilowatt hour to the cost of electricity.
Okay, so that's one solution. What else do they propose?
Well, even more promising is the fact that the inverters used to connect wind turbines, solar panels, and batteries to the grid can be programmed to provide some of these ancillary services. This is called virtual or synthetic inertia and voltage control.
So it's like teaching those inverters to behave more like traditional generators, even though they don't have those big spinning parts.
Exactly. And grid operators are increasingly requiring new renewable energy installations to have these capabilities built in through grid codes.
That's interesting. So as the grid becomes more reliant on renewables, the rules are changing to ensure they can play a bigger role in grid stability.
Absolutely. And the next generation of inverters, they're called grid-forming inverters, are even more sophisticated. They can actively regulate voltage and frequency in grids with very little traditional generation.
That sounds pretty cutting edge. What about balancing reserves? That's that instant backup power you need to match fluctuations in supply and demand.
Right. For that, This study points to a mix of existing flexible power plants, batteries, demand-side management, and even wind and solar plants themselves, which can be operated below their maximum output to provide some upward flexibility.
So even those intermittent sources can play a role in balancing the grid.
Yes. And studies in Germany, which this study cites, show that with high levels of renewables, you actually don't need much additional primary reserve capacity beyond what's needed anyway.
That's good to hear. What about black start capability? How do you restart a grid that's powered by the sun and wind if there's a complete blackout?
That's a really important question. This study suggests a few pathways. Hydropower plants often have the ability to start up independently without needing external power.
Oh, right, because they can just use the water stored in their reservoirs to get going.
Exactly. And then there are diesel generators, which can also provide black start, though they obviously aren't ideal from an emission standpoint. But this study highlights something interesting. Batteries are increasingly being used for black start.
Really? So you can use battery storage to jumpstart the grid?
Yep. There have been successful demonstrations in Germany and California where battery systems were used to restart gas turbines after a blackout.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So those big batteries can act as a kind of emergency power pack for the grid.
Exactly. And this study even mentions that nuclear power, which some people see as a reliable baseload source, can actually be a bit tricky for black start. Many nuclear plants need a continuous power supply to keep their cooling systems running, so they can't just start up on their own.
That's a good reminder that there's no such thing as a perfect energy source. Every technology has its strengths and weaknesses.
Absolutely. And looking to the future, this study suggests that decentralized renewable energy sources, coupled with local storage, could also play a role in black start scenarios. Like, imagine having solar panels and batteries on rooftops or in neighborhoods, and they could provide those initial pockets of power to begin the restoration process.
That's a pretty cool vision of a more resilient grid. Okay, so it sounds like this study makes a strong case that the technical challenges of a 100% renewable grid can be solved. But they don't stop there, right? They introduce a couple of their own feasibility criteria.
They do. And the first one is about the sustainability of the fuel source itself. They argue that a truly feasible energy source needs to be able to meet global energy demand for a very long time.
Like not just for the next few years, but for decades, even centuries.
Exactly. And by that measure, they say that traditional uranium-based nuclear power doesn't really pass the test.
Because there's only so much uranium in the ground, right?
Right. They cite figures on known uranium reserves and estimate that, based on current global electricity consumption, those reserves might only last for a few decades. And if we start electrifying other sectors like transportation and heating, that timeline gets even shorter.
That's a sobering thought. It's easy to forget that even nuclear power relies on a finite resource.
It is. And this study contrasts that with the virtually inexhaustible nature of renewable energy sources.
Right. The sun isn't going to run out of energy anytime soon.
Exactly. And then they also briefly touch on the challenge of integrating inflexible nuclear plants with the variable output of renewables. They suggest that from a cost-effectiveness standpoint, they're not the most natural partners.
Okay, so that's their first additional criterion. What about the second one?
Their second criterion is about relying on proven technologies.
Well,
They basically say, look, we shouldn't be basing our energy future on things that haven't been demonstrated at scale.
makes sense. Don't put all your eggs in a basket that might turn out to be empty.
Exactly. And they argue that most 100% renewable scenarios rely on technologies that are already proven. We have decades of experience with wind turbines, solar panels, hydropower, and grid infrastructure. And battery storage is rapidly maturing as a technology. They even mention large-scale battery deployments like the one in South Australia and the growing number of utility-scale batteries in the U.S. as evidence of this.
So their argument is, we have the tools we need right now. We don't need to wait for some magical breakthrough.
Right. And they contrast this with things like breeder reactors and nuclear fusion.
Oh, those technologies that are often presented as potential game changers.
Right. But this study highlights that breeder reactors still face technical challenges. They're expensive, and they carry potential safety and proliferation risks. And as for fusion, they point out that it's still a long way from being commercially viable.
So they're saying, let's focus on what works, what's scalable, and what we can deploy now.
Exactly. And beyond those main points, this study also addresses some other concerns that were raised. Like, they talk about the feasibility of energy storage more broadly.
Because even with a huge grid and all these fancy ancillary services, you still need a way to store energy when there's a surplus and release it when there's a deficit, right?
Right. And this study reiterates that battery technology is improving rapidly and costs are coming down. They also mention other storage options like pumped hydro, compressed air energy storage, and even things like power to gas, where you use surplus renewable electricity to create hydrogen or methane.
So it's not just about batteries, there's a whole suite of storage technologies that can play a role.
Exactly. And then this study briefly touches on the issue of biomass.
Ah, right, because using biomass for energy can be controversial depending on how it's sourced and managed.
Exactly. They acknowledge the sustainability concerns, but point out that many recent studies are more careful about how they account for biomass availability, or even exclude it altogether in some cases.
So there's an awareness of the potential pitfalls and a move towards more sustainable approaches.
Right. And finally, this study talks about carbon capture and storage, or CCS.
That technology that's supposed to capture carbon dioxide emissions from power plants and bury them underground, right?
Exactly. But this study highlights that CCS still faces challenges. It's expensive, there are concerns about the long-term safety of storing CO2 underground, and some approaches, like direct air capture, are still very early stage.
Okay, so they're not ruling out CCS entirely, but they're not relying on it as a silver bullet either.
Right. So after going through all the technical stuff, this study also considers the socioeconomic viability of 100% renewable energy systems.
Because it's not just about a technology, right? It's about whether people will accept it, whether it's affordable, and whether it fits into the broader social and political landscape.
Exactly. And on the social side, they highlight the consistently high levels of public support for renewable energy that are seen in surveys worldwide.
So people generally like the idea of getting their energy from clean sources.
Yeah, they do. But this study acknowledges that there can be local opposition to specific projects, like wind farms or transmission lines. And they suggest solutions like engaging with communities early in the planning process and exploring alternative approaches like offshore wind or burying transmission cables underground.
So it's about finding ways to minimize impacts and address concerns.
Right. And then on the economic side, this study points to the rapidly decreasing costs of renewable energy. Like wind and solar are already cheaper than fossil fuels in many parts of the world.
Which is incredible when you think about how expensive they used to be.
I know, right? And they cite studies showing that 100% renewable electricity systems can be cheaper overall than systems based on fossil fuels, especially when you factor in the environmental and health costs of pollution.
Ah, right, those externalities that are often ignored in traditional cost calculations.
Exactly. And they point to recent auction results for solar and wind projects coupled with battery storage, where we've seen really low prices as further evidence of this economic competitiveness.
So it's not just a feel-good story anymore. Renewables are making economic sense.
Absolutely. And they even touch on the viability of nuclear power, which was favored by the authors of the original paper that this study is responding to.
Okay, and what do they say about nuclear?
They highlight some of the challenges, like the high upfront costs of building new nuclear plants, concerns about safety and accidents, the problem of radioactive waste disposal, public acceptance issues, and the potential for proliferation.
So they're basically saying that nuclear has its own set of economic and social hurdles to overcome.
Exactly. And then the study goes even further. They point out that there are already tons of studies out there that have looked at 100% renewable energy scenarios for various regions and the world as a whole. They say the authors of the original paper didn't really consider all the evidence that's out there.
So they're broadening the scope and saying, look, this isn't just a fringe idea. There's a whole body of research that supports this.
Right. And they even challenge this idea that Iceland is the only developed country with close to 100% renewable electricity. They list a bunch of other countries and regions that have achieved high renewable energy shares, like Paraguay, Norway, Uruguay, Costa Rica, and parts of Germany, New Zealand, and Scotland.
So there are already real-world examples of places moving towards 100% renewables. It's not just a theoretical concept.
Exactly. And they also clarify what happened with the South Australian blackout in 2016, which some critics have blamed on wind power.
Oh, right. That was a big event that got a lot of attention.
Yeah, and this study points out that the official investigation concluded that the blackout was caused by a software control issue, not by wind power itself. And those control settings have since been updated.
Okay, so they're debunking some of the myths and misconceptions that have been circulating about renewables.
Exactly. So having gone through all of that, what would you say is the key takeaway from this study?
Well, it seems like they're making a very strong case that 100% renewable electricity systems are not just technically feasible, but they're also becoming increasingly viable from a socioeconomic perspective. Like,
Right.
we can do this, and we can do it in a way that makes sense for people, the planet, and the economy.
I completely agree. And what I find really compelling is that they frame this transition to 100% renewables not as some radical disruptive upheaval, but as a logical and cost-effective evolution of our existing energy systems.
Right. It's about building on what we already have, incorporating new technologies, and making smart choices about how we manage our energy resources.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really important question for you, the listener. Having explored all the arguments presented in this study, what are your thoughts on how quickly and ambitiously we can and should pursue this transition to a sustainable energy future?
It's not about some distant utopia. It's a practical pathway forward.
Right. A pathway based on sound technology and economics.
Definitely a lot to think about. Thanks for guiding us through this deep dive into Response to Burden of Proof, a comprehensive review of the feasibility of 100% renewable electricity systems.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
And thank you, listener, for joining us on this journey. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.